In the first module of your prompt engineering specialization on Coursera, you referenced Pokemon in a ChatGPT prompt. This got me thinking, if you had to describe your career as a movie or video game, what genre would it be?
Wow, that's a great question. Well, right now it's a bit like a science fiction movie where the UFO has been discovered and I'm one of the scientists that's getting to explore it and find out all this future technology that I didn't think would exist in my lifetime. So that's the way I describe it. So I would say science fiction right now.
What inspired you to work with GenAI, specifically prompt engineering, and what keeps you in the field?
Well, when ChatGPT came out, before it actually came out, I had a PhD student who was doing a lot with some of the early GPTs, and he kept telling me, "Oh, it's fascinating what it can do," and I wasn't really paying attention. And then he had graduated, and ChatGPT came out, and he started texting me one day, and he's like, "You really have to go look at ChatGPT," and it was like right after it came out. And I went and I looked at it and I was like, that's really interesting. But I think there was this initial resistance to it, right? I didn't want it to work so well, right? Because, it started doing things that looked like what I do as a software engineer. And so it's kind of like this resistance. But then I started exploring it and I realized sort of how creative you could get with it. And what I always tell people is that one of the first aha moments I had with it is I was actually on the phone with my dad and we were coming up with things to tell it to do or ask it. And basically, we said is like, what would have to change in the world if we didn't have odd numbers? And it gave this really spectacular answer of like all of the things that would have to change if we didn't have odd numbers and how we might, approach getting around not having odd numbers. And like that's a really hard question, right? That's not something that a computer has been built to answer before. And that was the moment where I was like, okay, this is much deeper. What can I do with this capability? Because it allows me to use that as part of like what a computer could do was much more limited before. And now one of the building blocks I have in a computer now is to be able to go and answer questions like, or imagine an answer. It doesn't have to be the right answer. It's just to imagine a answer that imperfect or perfect, who cares? It's this new building block I have, and what can I go and create with it? I had started off as a visual arts major, and it's like somebody handed me a new palette that I can work with and paint with. And so, what can I do and create with this new thing? And so that's the way I approach it. And what keeps me into it is like we haven't even gotten close to exploiting all of the capabilities that we were handed when the first version of ChatGPT came out, and we've rocketed off to all these other versions. So the amount of exploration that we have to do at this unique point in time where I feel like I'm just lucky enough to be experiencing a fundamental change in what humans can do and what computers can do that is a once in a lifetime moment. Like the ability to be part of that is hugely motivating and exciting.
AI is often seen as a technical field, but prompt engineering highlights that role of creativity you just discussed. As someone with an appreciation for the arts, what are your favorite ways to incorporate Gen AI into your creative processes?
Well, I think you have to look at using GenAI. Like, I think too many people approach GenAI as give me an answer or do the work for me, as opposed to thinking of it as, a color on their palette or something that can give them a perspective. But the key is to go and use it to get lots and lots of different perspectives on something to inform and inspire yourself so that you can make the ultimate creative choices or decisions. And so I think of it as like, when you go into a museum, the goal isn't to go into the museum and to see one painting and copy it. I mean, maybe that's your goal if you're trying to practice something. And sometimes that's a good use of a museum is to go in and see one work of art and really study it, try to copy it and learn from it. But really, typically, you're going into a museum to see a breadth of different ideas of how to express something, and then to take that back and be inspired by it and then come up with your own. And I think people need to use Gen AI more like that, where you go and you use it to generate a lot of different ideas, a lot of different perspectives on something to learn from, but also to inspire your own sort of creativity. And then at the end of the day, the goal is to go and build your own artwork. And so I think that's kind of the mentality we need to cultivate more of that. And I think that's the way to think about it from a creative perspective is like go in and look and explore. But at the end of the day, you're going to go back and you may use it as the source of the palette that you create from, or you may go and start from scratch and do it all manually by writing out, manually or coding manually or whatever it is. And I think that's just it changes how we work and how we can use a computer for creative sort of pursuits.
I'm going to talk a little bit about some of your work in your research paper towards a catalog of prompt patterns to enhance the discipline of prompt engineering. You and your co-authors describe the current state of prompt engineering as too ad hoc and advocate for a more systematic approach. How would you describe this vision for the future for prompt engineering?
Well, it's interesting because I wrote that paper a while back now, and I think I still have somewhat of the same approach. But if I look back on that paper, I think really what we were trying to get to was helping people to see sort of patterns and structures that are repeated in common. So we've done this in software for a long time, as we've had this concept of patterns in software, and what their goal is to help guide you on how something could be designed, how you could do it, and to kind of give you a sort of set of sort of conceptual building blocks that help you when you're designing a system or thinking about it. Having these conceptual building blocks helps you to think through how to put it together. And so I wanted to do something like that for prompting, where it wasn't just like, I'm going to go express a bunch of text, but I'm going to think more systematically about what are my building blocks that I can use to communicate and solve problems with a large language model. Like, give me some building blocks, kind of like Legos, and then I can be off and I can start thinking about systematically different ways of putting them together to solve problems. And to sort of put some sort of conceptual boundaries around the pieces or the blocks that people are putting together, and also to kind of put some together some why. Why would you use this block? And what other ones might it go with? And I think that's what's helpful. I think it's also going to become more and more important because a lot of the things that we're going to be doing in the future aren't going to be one prompt anymore. They're going to be a sequence of prompts. And so when you start putting together sequences of prompts, or you put together one prompt and then the machine puts together a sequence of prompts behind the scenes, thinking about in terms of Legos or building blocks and how they snap together is really important to think about how you would sort of decompose. The other thing is these models allow us to apply computing to things that we haven't applied computing to before, to thoughts and ideas and creating new things. And it's this weird area that's like at the intersection of like, to solve problems, you kind of have to think systematically like you did in computer science, but at the same time, you have to think in a much more creative and different way and wider set of perspectives. And so it's trying to figure out how do you blend those two together and be at the intersection of one being sort of systematic and methodical about how you break things down and express them, but at the same time being really creative and trying to put them together. And so that was really the goal, is to try to find something that sits at that intersection that's not overly prescriptive, but at the same time provides enough structure to go and build and imagine.
I really liked your analogy about the Legos, and it made me think of your Coursera course, Generative AI for Kids, Parents, and Teachers. You discuss how leaders can help children approach AI safely and effectively. How do you envision the education space will change alongside AI?
It's really hard to know exactly. One is, I don't think it's likely that AI is just going to go and become the educator. I think there's always this grand vision that we're going to go and automate everything. And I think that's great. I think there's a lot of things that we can automate, but I really think that there's a world of augmented intelligence where we have a human in the loop that's empowered and can do more and solve bigger problems. And I think one of the places where there's huge amounts to be gained is by thinking about how we teach people to use it to enhance their learning. And so I did the course with Barb Oakley where we were exploring ways that you could use generative AI to, help you understand things. For example, take concepts that you don't understand and re-explain them in terms of concepts you do understand to make it easier to bridge that gap. And I think we haven't really built out a really thorough understanding of all of sort of the techniques that you could teach somebody to support their own learning with generative AI. See, I think a lot of the vision right now is of this idea that we're just going to throw some agent or some assistant over the wall and like the learner is going to magically have a better experience. But I think you get there by teaching them how to use it to support themselves, as opposed to this idea that you're just going to fully automate the teaching process. I think it's really about teaching them and empowering them to know how to use it to support their own learning and also to figure out how they like to support their learning with it. Because there's going to be certain things that, you know, like my son, he knows how to have ChatGPT quiz him on anything, and he absolutely has no interest in doing that. he still likes to make flashcards and do other things. And he's at home with me, and I'll be like, okay, buddy, let's have ChatGPT. He's like, Dad, stop. Like I'm not interested in doing that. I've written my flashcards. You and mom can quiz me. Please do not hand me off to ChatGPT. So the person who's learning has to figure out how to use it to help them and what they like to use it to help them with, and also what they don't. And it's not just this fully automated throw an assistant over the wall type thing. So I think that's one is we have to really focus on teaching people how to use it to support their learning. And then I think we need to teach and explore all the different ways that teachers can use it to support their teaching. And again, I don't think it's the fully automated space, but I think it's allowing them to figure out what is it that they want to do with it and showing them all the possibilities. Do they want to go and teach them so they can go create interactive experiences for their students? Well, some teachers may want to do that and it may make sense. Is it teaching them how to use it to brainstorm lesson plans or to brainstorm examples? I think right now we need to really think about teaching people how to use it more effectively, as opposed to believing that we can just create magic technology that's going to automate everything. I don't think that's the case. I think it's really about teaching people how to be empowered in their learning by it or empowered in their teaching by it.
What is the biggest challenge you see among prompt engineering beginners, and what advice helps them overcome it?
I'd say number one is that people approach it like it's internet search. I'm going to type in a
Yes.
question just like I would have on a major search engine, and that's the limit of how they use it. And I think one is getting people to overcome that and start thinking about telling the generative AI to solve problems for them, as opposed to asking it questions, and start thinking about how to use it to solve problems as opposed to using it to, appear to do an internet search. So I think that's step one. I think step two is getting people away from the idea of using it to generate an answer for them and instead using it to support their decision making or problem solving or work. And I think there's a very different sort of style. Like when you're thinking about giving an answer, it's like write the email. If you're thinking about how do I use it to support me and work, you start thinking about, okay, I've got an email. Let me sort of analyze it to try to think through the perspective of the other person. What might be their motivations? What is their company? What is the area? What are their concerns in this space? How might they be doing this? What are different ways that I could present this information and explain it back to them and communicate my points while also being sensitive to theirs? And then it becomes a completely different world where you're using computation to help you think through this interaction with this other person. And the end goal is to write an email that's better than you could have written before, not to have AI write you a bad version that you go and maybe like edit some or decide is terrible and throw away. Like the goal is really to inform your thinking and use it in a different way. But it requires a very different sort of approach to generative AI, is getting away from that. It's going to give me the answer to it's something that I'm working with to help me arrive at a better answer. I think the sort of third thing that people struggle with is so many jobs, so many areas. I think creativity has been taken away from the job, and people have been taught not to be creative in the job. And roles have been crafted to limit creativity. And I think that the organizations that succeed with generative AI are the ones where they figure out how do we allow our people to be creative and innovative and support them in doing that with generative AI. And it's really hard to go into a place where you're in a role where you don't have many hours in the day left. You're already working really hard. They've taken away all the creativity, and now how are you going to, and now somebody's told you, by the way, go use this generative AI thing and do amazing things. And it's like, well, where are you going to find the time in the day to learn about it, to do it, to be inspired? So getting out of that mold of like, how do you give people space and time and inspiration to feel creative again? I think that's what's really hard. And so I think lots of organizations struggle with that piece of figuring out, well, why isn't it, why are we having all this magic success with generative AI? And I think it's because, one, I think there's overemphasis on this idea that we're going to automate everything. Two, there's underappreciation of all the valuable things it can do that aren't full automation, but actually are supporting a human being. And three, they haven't really emphasized the people portion of it, of like getting people inspired, give them time and space to learn and go and build and learn to do things with it.
How do you see AI transforming the way people access and understand scientific information?
One of the amazing things about AI is it can act as our mediator to understand things that we may not understand well. So it could be, if you go back to the very beginning, when they were building transformer models, they were testing them on like language translation tasks. It just turns out that one of the things it can do is it can translate from a scientific language into a language that I understand. And that language that I understand can be English, or it can be like the way that I speak and the sets of concepts I understand, or it could be a set of language that a 10-year-old understands, or the set of language that a 10-year-old boy who likes Pokemon and BMX understands. And that's what's kind of amazing for it, is that it can translate into sort of arbitrary languages, but it has a sense of the language that a particular audience can understand. And that's a really powerful thing because it allows you to go and approach a subject or a topic and have it translated into concepts that are helpful to you. And so it's very personalized. So I can go in and say, like, explain this to me from this perspective using these concepts. And so it might be going and taking scientific literature. It might be going and approaching computer code that I don't fully understand and having it explained to me. It might be taking data that has all kinds of weird complexities that I'm trying to, cipher and try to help me understand it. Now, it's imperfect. It might make mistakes, but oftentimes, if I don't understand it at all, an imperfect explanation is super valuable to me because at least it helps me move farther down the path of understanding it. And a lot of times I would go and ask a human being and they would give me an imperfect explanation of it. In fact, I think as a teacher, that's probably what I do all day long is give people imperfect explanations for them. It's perfect from my perspective. It's imperfect from that person's perspective because it doesn't fully account for everything that they know. So I think that's one of the things that's really powerful about it is it acts as this translator, but it's a translator that I control and I can personalize based on what I understand, what I know, what I'm interested in.
We talked about an aha moment earlier with just how ChatGPT works and the things that it can do. Do any aha moments come to mind where a small tweak in your prompt drastically improved AI performance or outcomes?
Well, I mean, it happens all the time. I think I had an aha moment earlier today. So one of the things that is coming this year, I mean, it's here, but it's going to really, really make a big appearance with generative AI is this idea of agents. And so the way I explain agents is you can go and you can ask ChatGPT to give you a recipe to bake a cake. And then you can ask it to tell you each step like one at a time. Like, tell me this first step to bake the cake, and I'll go off and I'll do some work and I'll come back and tell you how that first step went. And then it'll, based on how things went, tell me what the next step is. And it can walk me through like baking a cake. Well, an agent, that's it exhibiting agency, where it's getting to decide what the next step is. And then based on how I perform with it, it decides what to tell me to do next. And so it becomes the driver that gets to decide what the steps are and when to execute them in what order. And it can adapt. Like if I go and I tell it, hey, I mix these things together, but it seems too runny, and I take a picture of it and it looks at it and it's like, oh yeah, that's way too runny. Like Jules made a mistake, added too much water, probably. I need to adapt. Maybe I tell him to add some more flour or something to adapt. And so that's an agent. It's generative AI. It can look like a conversation, just like we do with ChatGPT. The difference with agents when people start talking about them is rather than it telling me what to do as a human being, it's probably telling a computer what to do. So go and take this step, and then the computer goes and executes the step, and the computer tells it, here's the result of that step. And then it gets to decide what the next thing to do is. So there's always this mix of like, do we have it go and work fully reactive and adaptive, where it goes one step at a time and then reacts to what happens? Or does it get just build a full plan? Like, here's the recipe, computer, go and run the recipe. And those are very different ways of working. And the aha moment this morning was it's super easy to have it do both. Tell it go and try to build the whole recipe and have the computer cook it. And if it runs into an error, then fall back to going one step at a time and trying to figure out where the problem is. And I realized that it's as simple as that. It's just telling it, prefer to do the whole plan at once and ask the computer to execute it. And if for any reason there's an error, just fall back to going one step at a time. And like that simple bit of language or thought or expression of idea, then it can go and do it. And so like there's so many things like that where that is a wildly powerful concept that is like two sentences in a prompt and suddenly allows it to do something that is I don't know how I would have done that effectively with a computer before. I'll give you one that's less technical from back in the day was the persona pattern. The thing that the aha moment for me with the persona pattern was when I saw examples where the persona wasn't a person. It was a thing, like a system. And in the particular case that really got me thinking about the power of the persona was when I saw people that were basically saying, act as a computer. I'm going to type in commands to this computer, and you're going to output what the computer would have output. And then I suddenly realized, oh, wait, a persona can be anything. It could be like the postal system, act as the postal system. You're going to react to the way the postal system would, act as this animal, act as whatever it is. And suddenly you have the creativity to dream up a simulation through a persona by describing the persona of the thing that you want to simulate. And so then I was using that in my cybersecurity class. I was saying, act as a computer that's been the victim of a cyber attack, and I'm going to type in commands and you're going to respond with what the computer would respond. And what's interesting is it would like dream up things that had been done to that computer that made it respond differently than normal because it had had an attack. And that was sort of like an aha moment for me was like a persona can be much more than just a human being.
I was actually about to ask about if there was a persona pattern or just your favorite everyday prompt or a practical insight that we can apply day to day.
So one that I've been using a lot lately is I will say, tell me how we would measure or evaluate this thing. And this is one that I sort of learned from somebody else. So I call this the Keen pattern in one of my classes. And I sort of learned it from Sean Keen, and then I've sort of adapted. I have a quicker version of it. And so what it is like you discuss the goals. Like, here's the thing that I'm trying to do or create. Let's talk about how we would evaluate it. What would our goals be for a really good one of whatever it is? And so I'll say that in a prompt, like tell me like the ideal qualities of X, whatever X is. And it'll describe all of them. And I say, now go and create an X that has those qualities. Tell me what it should look like first. Tell me all the goals and good characteristics it should have. And it's basically creating a blueprint for itself. Now I'll say, now go and do that thing that you just said you to do. And so it's like a simple little like two-step process, but often I get much better output out of it. But also, when I see the goals and all the things laid out, it also gives me a chance to edit and say, I don't care about that, but I also care about this that you didn't include. And it helps me to start thinking more in terms of goals and outcomes and what I'm trying to achieve, but also think of other things I might be trying to achieve that I hadn't thought of. And then going and building it is just telling, like, we are discussing the ideas and now go and execute it. But I can normally do that in two prompts. And that's one that I like to use a lot these days. I also do the same thing for a plan, like plan how you would do this. Now do that, run that plan that you just came up with.
How would you recommend employees approach AI in their day-to-day work and long-term career development beyond the typical conversations we hear?
My recommendation would be invest in yourself, go and take time to learn about it on your own, regardless of what your employer is going to do. Go and learn about it on your own in the way that you want to learn about, emphasizing thinking creatively, and I would say applying it to aspects of your life outside of your work. So, like, a lot of employers still have resistance about like what can go in it and is it private and all of these things. I would say go apply it to things you have to do outside of your work where you get to decide what data goes into it and what doesn't. And really learn about it and get creative in pushing yourselves in terms of like what you can get it to do. I created that meal planning with ChatGPT class because I wanted to show people that like the depth of what it can do is so much more than what they're thinking. And a great example of this is my wife. She uses it a lot in cooking, and she was using it more in cooking than I was. And this was before I created the class, and she was talking to a friend saying, "Oh yeah, I generated this great recipe with ChatGPT." And her friend said, "Why on earth would you ever use ChatGPT to generate a recipe? Why wouldn't you just go like look it up on a blog or a website or a cookbook?" And at the moment, she didn't have a good answer of what it was. She couldn't like vocalize like what is it that it does for her that's so helpful. And we started talking about it. And my goal with that class was to come up with all the things that you can't do with a cookbook or a website or a blog or some other tool. And one example of them that I always use for people is I say for meal planning, I can go find the most amazing meal plan on the web. But when I show up at the end of a long day and I'm tired, I'm not going to cook whatever I'm supposed to cook because I'm just like, out of energy. And then I might eat out and like it's less healthy, it's probably more expensive, and I waste food. And no blog, website, or anything can fix that problem, but ChatGPT can fix it because if I tell it to meal plan and I give it a screenshot of my calendar, it can recognize that you're really busy on these 2 days. And if I put in a complicated recipe, then you're probably not going to bother cooking it. Or even better yet, if I create something that has leftovers from the day before, then you're going to show up tired and you're already going to have something to eat. And it can do that, but no static book, no website, no tool can do that. And that's like one of like an infinite number of things that it can do for you if you start thinking more creatively about how you use it to support you. And so it's all of those types of things. Or if you take a recipe and you realize, oh, I forgot to buy the things, or you get home and you've got like a limited set of options in your fridge and you snap a picture of what you actually have left and you say, give me a really creative recipe that has these parameters, it can do it. And it's like all of those types of things that I think really teach people how to use it more thoughtfully and more effectively. Um, and a lot of those things are really easy to learn about in cooking or planning a trip and vacation or whatever it is.
Is there anything else that you'd like to add that we haven't covered yet?
I think one way of thinking about how to use generative AI is think about it like if you could hire an assistant for yourself, and you could give them a task, just about any task you can think of. And in general, they could write you a one pager or a series of one pagers. Like, how do you use that person? Well, if when you specify it like that, it's kind of hard, like, right? It's like so open-ended, like how am I going to use this person? What am I going to get them to do for me? And that's a bit what it's like approaching generative AI. And it takes some time to start thinking about and recognizing opportunities to get help. I don't know why, but all of the software has decided that the best use of generative AI in a meeting is to summarize the meeting. And it's like, this is the last thing I would want to do is like have somebody sit in the meeting with me and then I leave the meeting and they're going to tell me about the meeting that I just sat through that I probably didn't want to be in the first place. But what's much more interesting is like if you have somebody who's sitting there and then they say, okay, I listened to everybody and you talked about this, but it's really not clear to me what these things meant. Or I see you drew that thing on the board over there while you were drawing and brainstorming. I went ahead and turned that into a document for you. Or, I heard you discussing this and I figured you were probably going to need this analysis next. So I went ahead and thought ahead and built an analysis for you, a one pager that was related to what you were talking about. You didn't ask for it, but I thought of it up. I brainstormed something and here it is. It's hard to start thinking in that mode of like, what would you get that person to do? But once you start thinking about it, you can have that person, or in this case, you can have the generative AI go and do all kinds of really valuable things, but it's really about how creative you can get in what you can get them to do in one page. You have to start thinking about what would I have a human being do as opposed to what would I have a computer do. It's just a tough thing to start, getting in that sort of creative thinking mentality of how will I use that resource?
In 5 words or less, what's the most important thing someone should do when prompting?
Be creative.
Only needed 2 words, even better. Just to wrap up, what is the best piece of career or life advice you've ever received?
Ooh, that's tough. Well, I think right now the most appropriate career or life advice is that things are alive when they're changing, right? And a lot of times we resist change and we fear change. But change is like the definition of life. If something isn't changing, it's not alive. And so I think in this time when things are changing so rapidly, people get fearful and they pull back. And we just need to say things are more alive than ever. It's more exciting. There's more life being injected when there's all this change and movement. It's just injecting sort of more of what we define as life and alive. Now, it's different than we can expect. It's harder to predict, but it's what makes things like exciting. And I think we should embrace that and be excited about what's happening and all the potential and all the creativity that's going to take place.